Hey guys, welcome back to Schoolhouse Beer and Brewing's Grains to Glass, your home brewing video tutorials. I'm Thomas Monty, owner of Schoolhouse Beer and Brewing. Thanks for showing up again, and I'm here to help you with all your questions that you have in your home brewing adventure. Today, what we're going to be talking about is how much yeast to pitch in a 5-gallon batch. Now remember, that's a 5-gallon batch. We get the question a lot at the shop, and so let me take you back. When I first started brewing, I was doing the same thing you were doing, sanitizing a pack of yeast, opening it up, and just throwing it in whatever I brewed, whatever 5 gallons of wort I had. I was making good beer, I really was, and one of my friends had been brewing a lot longer than I had. He asked me, he said, how much yeast are you throwing in? And I was like, why? He's like, well, I'm getting some kind of off flavors to it. And I told him, I said, well, I threw in 1 pack, just like they told me at the shop. Then he said, you're going to need a little bit more than that. I looked back over at my notes and I noticed about my final gravities, I wasn't hitting the way I wanted to, especially the beers over 6%, or a starting gravity of 1060. After doing a little bit of research, I found out that different packs of yeast or different kinds of yeast have different kinds of alcohol tolerances and also different amounts of final gravities. I also noticed my lower gravity beers, my 3, 5s, under 6%, were much better. Did a little bit more research and found out the original gravity amount of alcohol that I was striving to hit was not only determining factor for the amount of yeast needed to make a fantastic beer that I wanted and what you want. I found out that specific styles of beer require different amounts of yeast. So I dug around a little bit farther and I found out I could make a starter using a stir plate and an Erlenmeyer flask. If you want to learn how to do a starter, hit the button up here. It'll take you to one of our other videos. It'll take you all the way through it. But today what we're just going to talk about is figuring out if it's easier for you just to buy a couple extra packs of yeast. That's where I was. I'd had a couple $100 into this hobby and I didn't want to really spend any more on equipment. So what was a fledgling homebrewer supposed to do? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. The amount of yeast you need in a pitch. And we're going to go all the way through it, and we're going to be looking at ale yeast and ale yeast only, not lagers. So here we go. Cheers. So how does the pitch rate affect your beer? Pitch rate has a huge effect on both flavor and aroma profiles on your beer. Now, how does that happen? Well, one of the flavors that you get out of all your beers, you're going to talk about esters. And those are the flavors that you get in your yeast. Now, yeast is probably I would say, the most important thing when it really does come to flavor on your beer. Now, let's talk about low pitch rates because you have low and high. Just think about it. You could have excess diacetyl, which is an off flavor, and it's not what you're looking for. Increase on higher fusel alcohol formations. What is that? It's how much heat you're getting off of it. Increased esters, because the yeast is sticking around longer, it's taking longer to generate, you're getting more of a flavor that you might not want. Increased sulfur compounds, think of lagers and pilsners. High terminal gravities, that's where you're really having some issues, some stuck fermentation, and you have a really high risk of infection. Now, high pitch rates. Yes, just throwing as much yeast as is possible is not your best bet. Trust me. You can get low ester production, very fast fermentations, which will lead into thin or lacking body mouthfeel. You can get yeasty flavors that are left over because you have so much yeast in here. And it's just dying down and it's just sitting on that trub. There's all kinds of things that you can have going on by going either way. So let's really look at what kind of yeast there are out there and what we can do to make that the perfect amount of yeast in a pitch. So one of the things I did find out after doing a little bit of research over time is that not all yeast styles or types are created equal. They all work the same way. Now, let's go back to the basics. The amount of viable yeast in a package of a yeast depends not only on the manufacturer, but also the freshness of it, and also the type, dry or liquid. I mean, either one of these are going to have different ones. Now let's talk about dry yeast. There's pros and cons on both. Dry yeast, a little 5-gram pack right here has about 200 billion cells. It's got a great shelf life. You're looking a year and a half, throw it in the refrigerator. Now, you got about 8 to 10 months if it's unrefrigerated. It can be shipped without worry of refrigeration, like I said, and it's less expensive than the alternative, which is liquid yeast. Dry yeast is packaged with yeast nutrients, so you don't have to do a yeast starter. We get that question a lot. Do I do a starter? No. I would suggest rehydrating it just to get it active, just like if you were baking. Now the cons. You won't have a lot of varieties out here. The varieties of them are real limited because they have to be extremely hardy when it comes to the dehydration method. This yeast can die if it can't live through that. Now, since nutrient is added, you can't make a starter with it, or you shouldn't make a starter, because what happens is that yeast is in a small volume of liquid wort, and it's going to eat everything really quickly. And if you've got nutrients in there, it's eating even quicker. So the yeast will start to grow and then die really quick, which kind of defeats the purpose of having the yeast nutrient in a dry. Dry is a one and done also. You really don't want to try to collect it because it's been dehydrated, then you've rehydrated and it comes back and you're just really, you're going to have some real off flavors on it. Now, liquid yeast, pros. Liquid yeast comes in hundreds of varieties, from American to Belgian to any style. I mean, Australian, all over the world. You can take one pack and build it up with a starter. We've talked about it. We're not doing starters today, but you can take one pack of this and build it up. With the growth of both home brewing and craft brewing, there are a lot of different producers out there. It's almost a cottage industry now. We've got some great ones coming up. One of my favorites is Omega Yeast. Omega is got its whole cottage industry. These guys are out of Chicago, Illinois, and they're doing amazing things. Not just with traditional yeast styles such as, California One, but they're making their own. Now, the cons. After liquid yeast has been packaged, there's a percentage that it starts to die over the month. Some people go up to 20%. I don't think it's that high, especially with the advancement in packaging and production. These guys are really making sure that they say 100 billion cells. There's going to be a lot more in there than you think. But if you get one that's a little bit older, you can do a starter and still raise it back up to whatever you need. So that's the difference between dry and liquid. Let's really start looking at the pitch rate, okay? And pitch rates are how much do you need per batch. So that brings us to our pitch rate. I want to preface this by saying that this is not exact. I'm using approximations. Now, if you want to get exact, use the Beersmith program that I've talked about in other videos. You can go up and watch other videos. And there are many yeast strains in the market that have extremely high alcohol tolerances, and they're meant for a lot of that. I'm speaking of for the majority of cultivated yeast strains in the United States or all over the world. I'm going to be talking about liquid yeast right off the bat, and we'll go from there. So most liquid yeast that you get from your home brew shop, such as White Labs or maybe white yeast, such as California One, has approximately 100 billion cells in it. That's roughly enough for a 1.050 original gravity, or about 5% ABV beer, give or take. So let's take a look at an 8% beer. Let's say we're going a little higher gravity. You're going to need about 300 billion cells for that. So you'd need 3 packs of this White Labs, since there's 100 billion cells in it. You need 2 packs of the Omega, which has 150 billion cells. One of the reasons why I like them, because they do put a little bit more. And I would suggest roughly 2 packs of dry yeast, since there's 200 billion cells in here and you're going to 300 billion cells for proper fermentation. Now, hitting your over pitching is really hard to do. So don't get too freaked out about, there's 100 extra billion cells. So let's take a rule of thumb. It should go something like this: 100 billion cells up to 1.050. 200 billion cells up to 1.068. 300 billion cells of yeast goes up to 1.080, and about 400 billion cells can take you to 1.1. Once again, if you need to learn how to make a yeast starter and save a little bit of money, hit the link up the top. Now, I've put some of this in the show notes, so please take a look. I hope this really did clear up some of the questions people have about how much yeast that they need, why do they need that yeast, and how to make a fantastic beer using the proper amount of yeast. I'm sure you'd love our podcast. If you love this, or you like us, or if you just kind of deal with us, you might like our podcast about the craft beer lifestyle, The Motley Brew, MOTLEYBRU, which you can find on both iTunes and Google Play. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment. Really appreciate everything you guys are saying and doing. Once again, cheers and thank you so much.